Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is the first video of 2025, but also the wrap up of my best reads of 2024. So as I like to do, I will start with stats. So I read 136 books in all this year, which compared with 144 from last year. 128 of those were fiction, 8 were non-fiction, 1 was a couple of plays in 1 volume, 2 were short stories, and 24 were poetry, which meant that there were 101 of the fiction books were novels. The poetry 24 is double what I read last year and is the most I've ever read. I was on a real poetry binge. So it does make me wonder how I read slightly less than last year, because obviously poetry collections tend to be quite short. But I think the reason for that was I read quite a few big books this year. I really can't remember how many big books I read last year. And just one of those books was a reread. Okay, and on to the breakdown of the books. 70 were written by men, 66 were written by women. I don't know what the percentage is, but normally the percentage is sort of 65-35. Obviously this is a lot closer to 50-50. And of those, 16 were by LGBTQ plus authors and 13 were by authors who were persons of colour. And in terms of the geography, I read 20 from the UK, 43 from the US and 65 from the rest of the world. And that breaks down into 34 from Europe, 9 from Latin America, 9 from Asia, 5 from Central America, 1 from Africa, and on top of the 5 from Central America there were 6 from Canada, so that's 11 in all. But obviously Canada is North America. Anyway, and just to break down the individual countries, in Europe the most were 5 from Spain and 5 from France, 4 from Italy, 3 from Norway, 3 from Ukraine, 3 from Ireland, 2 from Hungary, 2 from Portugal, 2 from Russia, and then 1 each from Armenia, Romania, Bulgaria, Germany, Austria and Switzerland. Moving over to the Americas, as I say, 6 from Canada, and then 1 from Cuba, 1 from Jamaica, 1 from St. Lucia, 1 from Mexico, 1 from Puerto Rico. And as to Latin America, 5 from Argentina, 2 from Brazil, 1 from Uruguay, 1 from Colombia, just the 1 from Africa, which was Algeria, and in Asia and Australasia, 3 from Australia, 2 from South Korea, and then 1 from Vietnam, 1 from India, 1 from Pakistan and 1 from Lebanon. And in terms of my ratings, 38 were 5 stars, 53 were 4 stars, 29 were 3 stars, 15 were 2 stars, and there was just 1 1-star, which makes my worst read of the year easy to say. That was the 1-star read, which was Sally Rooney's Conversations with Friends. I posted an hour-long video about why I didn't like that book, and indeed all the books I'm going to talk about today, I'm not going to go into much detail about them because obviously I've talked about them at slightly greater length in most cases in videos throughout the year. So in the show notes I will post the titles of the book, not in the orders of my favourites, just in a random order with the links, and you can go back to the original reviews of them should you so choose. Okay, so because I read so many poetry books this year, I did want to talk about my top 6. Is it 6? Yeah, 6. Now these are harder to order into an order, but coming in at number 6 is Caleb Femi's Poor. So Caleb Femi is a British poet of Nigerian heritage, and he grew up in Peckham in South London, which is one of the rougher, most crime-ridden areas of London. I mean, it's sort of being gentrified now. And this is just a book that spoke a lot to me. I'm not claiming that I grew up in a ghetto, and I certainly didn't grow up in Peckham, I used to have friends in Peckham, and I would go visit them once a year, and sure enough, one year someone was stabbed on the top deck of our bus on our annual pilgrimage to Peckham. But as I say, this really resonated with me. There was a lot I recognised. I write about, for example, knife crime a lot in my prose, and it comes out of this world. And then on to number 5 was Nam Lee's 36 Ways of Writing a Vietnamese Poem. And this is definitely the angriest book I wrote this year. Nam Lee writes kind of what he says in the title, you know, the different ways of trying to represent Vietnamese culture and heritage when he is born in America, or I can't remember if he was born in America or he was, no, I think he was a refugee in America after the Vietnam War. And just these different pulls on his identity of being American, of being Vietnamese, and each eroding the other to some extent, particularly his Vietnamese language. But obviously, you know, the American side is the more dominant within the culture around him. And at number 654, Victoria Chang's Obit. So this is very much a collection based around grief, as her father had a stroke and developed dementia, and her mother was dying of lung disease. But it's a really clever way of treating grief, because it's not specifically about things that her parents did that she has memories of. It's sort of conceptual deaths, obituaries for things that disappear conceptually. So each of the poems starts with such and such died. So example, Form died on August the 3rd, 2015, or Appetite died on March the 16th, 2015. And it's through examining these concepts, which she's finding it really hard to grasp hold of and retain and have memories of, the wider grief, not, as I say, not only of her parents, but of just how her life is changed ineluctably. And these things seem to be disappeared and erased from her life because her parents have died. And at number 3, Mojave Ghost by Forrest Gander. So this is also about grief, but modulated in a very different way. So he, within the space of, I think, 3 months, lost his wife and his mother to death, and he goes back to try and sort of snap himself out of it on a road trip down, I think, Route 66, which passes through the desert town that he grew up in, hence in the Mojave Desert. And it's just, as I say, brilliantly modulated. It's, you know, you're not overwhelmed by it being grief. It sort of creeps up on you that that's what this collection is about. And some of the words and the images, you know, drawn from the desert and the life in the desert, it's just fabulous stuff. At number 2, Danny Smith, Bluff, his new collection, sorry, their new collection. It's Danny Smith. What more do you need to say? Probably the best poet working today. You know, I've read all 3 of their collections, and all 3 of them have been splendiferous. Just a wonderful wordsmith and wrangler of language. And perhaps surprisingly, given the strength of those previous 5, my favourite was Toxicon and Arachne by Joelle McSweeney. And the reason I love this so much is because it kind of plays into my weak spot, or my wheelhouse, however you want to pronounce it, where there are detonations of words being put together you would never expect to be put together, and yet they're so rich and resonant, the images that it sparks off. I mean, I just love wordplay. I use it a lot in my own writing. So if a writer, you know, feeds into that, it's going to get a big tick from me. So this was my favourite poetry collection of the 24, Toxicon and Arachne by Joelle McSweeney. And before I go on to my top 10 novels, just to say I had no top read of the year in non-fiction. In my figures, you might recall, I only read 8 books that were non-fiction. None of them particularly blew me away, other than one that I'll come to in a minute. There are 2 other books I started for non-fiction November, but I didn't get through either of them. I'm really struggling. Each year I find myself struggling more and more with non-fiction. It's about the language, it's about the imagery. That's what I love in fiction. And when non-fiction fail to indulge in those, and let's face it, there's no reason why non-fiction should indulge in those if they're more about sort of conveying fact and things like that. I'm really struggling with non-fiction. The one exception I would make is Gordon Shepherd's 800-page book called Ha, H-A, which is a biography of Hubert Aquin, who was a French-Canadian Quebecois author who committed suicide. And he had all these different parts of his personality that he would show to some and not others, because he was obsessed with death, obsessed with suicide. And he pretty quickly realised that some people he could talk to about that and share openly because they had dark sides, whereas other people he couldn't. And it's a brilliant book. It's quite artfully done and uses artifice, which means that it could really veer into fiction rather than non-fiction, even though there's an awful lot of fact wrangled and researched about Hubert Aquin. But it stands nicely on that spectrum of, straight biography, sort of melding and merging into autofiction and faux biography done deliberately as fiction. And I've got a dedicated video on that, and I'll post the link to it. So that is an honourable mention. As 800 pages, it was my choice for March of the Mammoths, where you read a big book in March, and it was pretty good. The reason I haven't sort of said it's head and shoulders the winner of non-fiction is because I actually veer towards the notion of it being fiction, but you'd have to watch my review as to see why I say that. And again, just before I go on to the top 10 fiction reads, I like to discover a new author each year, and then I tend to binge read quite a few of their books. And this year it was the wonderful Carol Mazo, who is an American author. I read 3 of her books: Defiance, Ava, and The American Woman in the Chinese Hat. And all 3 of those flirted with the, if I'd done a top 20, for example, they, 2 or 3 of them might have been in that. So they just missed out on the top 20, on the top 10, sorry. I really, really like her work, and will try and track down some more to read next year. Okay, on to the top 10. Now, in recent past, I haven't been able to numerically order my top reads, so I've tended to do them thematically. This year, I haven't had a problem. This year has been a sort of straight hierarchy. I think what I said is about 38 sort of 5-star reads, and these are obviously represent 10 of them. But the other 28, I gave them 5 stars because there was lots to admire and that I could take from them, but they weren't perfect books. Now, these aren't perfect, but they were less flawed. And so number 10, Hans Smith, Portraits at the Palace of Creativity and Wrecking. This is a debut novel. It made, I think, was it the Goldsmiths Prize shortlist? This is a wonderful book about sort of contemporary Russia under Putin, although it's not directly referring to that. It's all sort of at one step removed. And about sort of a girl, 14-year-old girl, who feels very out of step with everyone around her. And she sort of pursues 2 different tracks in her life, and she's trying to discover which pole is it. So one is to become a sort of glamour model. All these sort of talent scouts are always looking within these cities in Russia for, potential models at the age of 14. There's something a bit sort of sleazy and unnerving about it. And she's doing this with her 2 best school friends. And on the other pole is this rebel girl at school, who's a new girl who's been booted out from her previous school, who is part of the protest movement against the government. And they are sort of focusing on restoring a museum or creating a museum to the gulags, which has been completely airbrushed out of history by not only the current regime, but obviously the Soviet regimes. And this protest movement wants to sort of show how tyrannical and absolutist and totalitarian the current government is, as just a sort of, the next one on after the collapse of the Soviet system. It's just, some of the language is brilliantly done. The tone of it and the voices in it are tremendous. At number 9, this was a real pleasant surprise. Vengeance is Mine by Marie Ndiaye, or Ndiaye, who's a French writer of, I think, Senegalese heritage. And I'd never really sort of come across her, and I can't remember how I think she was referenced in somebody else's book. So I picked this up as my first exposure to her. And again, I was just absolutely carried off by the tone of this, the voice, but also the plot was quite subversive. It was basically a woman has murdered her children, and the husband comes to this lawyer saying, everyone says it's a, closed case, that she'll be found guilty. I need you to defend her because she's not guilty. And so you think it's sort of going to be about this case of this murderous wife and mother, but it isn't at all. It's about the lawyer. A lawyer who has a maidservant who is an undocumented immigrant, who she is trying to get documents for her. It's about her relationship with the husband who's come to her because she thinks it's someone she knew from her childhood, and is trying to work out whether he's come to her for sort of rather underhand, nefarious reasons. There's just all these things going on in her life. So it's not about this murder case. It's not just a sort of faux true crime thing at all. It's a much deeper psychological study. And talking of psychological studies, we have Angela O'Keeffe's The Sitter. So this is about Hortense Cézanne, which is Paul Cézanne's wife, that an Australian writer who has basically been paralysed by grief after the death of her mother, or her father, I can't remember which now, manages to pick up a pen again because she's going to write this biography of Hortense Cézanne, who's a wife who has a terrible reputation in history. Because when she was on a shopping expedition in Paris when she was told her husband was dying back in the countryside, and she apparently refused to go back to him. And this is a painting that Cézanne did of his wife, and it's about her as wife, muse, also business manager. She was managed Cézanne's career, all these sorts of things, and in sort of deciding that she's going to write a biography of this woman, she sort of conjured her back into life, or her spirit back into life. And the book is a dialogue between the two. The first part is from Cézanne's wife's point of view, and the second is from the writer's point of view. And it's just very, very skillfully done. It's a brilliant beginning that sort of lures you into, what perspective and what world we're talking about here in a very, very economical, skillful way. It's not a sleight of hand, but it's that skillful. I just love this. I thought it was tremendous. And at 10, 9, 8, number 7. No, that's my poetry collection. I've gone wrong. Here we are. Number 7, The Long Form by Kate Briggs. So this is one of the first books I read in the year, and it's been in my top 10 reads ever since. So it's about a first-time single mother, and she's very isolated because she doesn't have a partner with her child, and she's in the world of the sort of prelingual 24 hours a day. So she sets herself the task that she's going to read Henry Fielding's book Tom Jones, and I've never read Tom Jones. Fielding claimed for it was a new type of novel. It was going to sort of change our conceptions of the novel, and it's just a brilliantly modulated sort of, again, conversation between being a single mother during COVID and post-COVID, being in isolation, with Tom Jones, with Harding, and other literary types as well. It's just supremely measured and controlled. I felt I was in the hands of a puppet master, but not in a bad way. Just someone who utterly led me through this book, holding my hand. It was terrific. And at number 6, sorry, I'm not very good at the numbers. Number 6, Laura Paulson's Spent Light. This was also on the Goldsmith shortlist, and very good it is too. It's one of those vertiginous reads where you're never quite sort of sure that your feet are on solid ground as you pursue it. So it starts off innocently enough with the female narrator being given a toaster, a sort of very techie toaster, by this old man because his wife has just died and he doesn't need it anymore. And what we get throughout the whole book is associations between objects and things which leap from the domestic and the mundane to anything in the world, you know, genocides, war, you know, blood diamonds, what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. Laura Paulson is by trade also a foreign correspondent journalist, and a lot of that feeds into here, and it's just brilliantly done. As I say, it's vertiginous, some of the leaps between something very sort of mundane, such as the birds in the garden or taking a walk along the canal, then leaps over to this sort of thing that's, you know, global importance. Wonderful stuff. And on to number 5. Again, I read this very early in the year. This is Verdigre by Michel Marie, Italian author. It's translated by Brian Robert Moore. And this is the story of a young boy on an estate in Italy, and one of the workers, unfortunately, is beginning to suffer from dementia, and this boy wants to walk him through his memories, and a bit like Paulson, I suppose, in a way, he has to reconstitute language for this guy because some of the connections have gone, have sort of burned out by his dementia. And the boy is finding different objects, different things to try and spark the connections in this guy's life, in his mind, in his memory. So it's a brilliant analysis of the relationship between signs and symbols and language, where he's having to forge new ones for this guy. And most of the book is unravelling these memories of what happened in their area during the war, under sort of Nazi occupation. So I won't spoil that, but for me it was just chock full of interesting linguistic and semiotic things, which again is like catnip to me. And on to number 4, I think a debut novel by Joelle Taylor, because she's ostensibly a poet first and foremost, but you can tell she's a poet because the language in this is sumptuous, absolute. On virtually every page this is an image or a combination of words, which, you know, I absolutely fell in love with. And the story, in a way, is a bit like The History Man, not The History Man, The Illustrated Man. Only this is The Illustrated Woman. She's covered head to foot in tattoos, and she goes to this tattoo shop, which is run by a stepmother and her stepchild. And she says, look, all of these represent stories in my life. Can you link them up? The only thing they need is linking up in ink, one to the other. And these stories are like portals. So each of the chapters is the story of the ink that the ink tells. But there's a sort of, behind all of this, there's the relationship of this woman, this inked woman, to the two women who you know, they think she's a walk up off the street. They're not aware that they already have a relationship to her, because this woman can travel through her tattoos, through the stories, through into the future and into the past, into history. And so, as much as it's about storytelling, and some beautiful storytelling, as I say, beautiful language, it's also, she's trying to get the penny to drop with these two women as to how they are related. And on to number 3. So this is a book Untitled by Shushan Avagian, American-Armenian author, on Tilted Axis Press. And I have done videos before sort of querying the notion of, is there such a thing as experimental fiction? And even though I sort of, my own writing is would be loosely in that camp, I don't actually think there is such a useful thing or concept as experimental fiction. But I think we confuse it for unconventional fiction, and this would definitely fit within that in a wondrous way. So it's about 2 contemporary Armenian American authors who want to resurrect 2 historical Armenian women authors who have been erased from history, one by the Soviets and one by the Turkish genocide. Both erased by the Soviets, but one was sort of more writing about the Armenian genocide at the hands of the Turks. So there was an erasure there. And it's constantly a dialogue about translation, whether translation is something new or whether it's just a sort of faithful reproduction. of somebody else's words about how can it be when there's cultural differences. It's about the changing face of Armenia now that it's, you know, slowly emerging into the modern world without the sort of Soviet burden on its back. But that means that it's hard for them to find historical landmarks to these two women because of the modernisation of Yerevan, the Armenian capital. It's just full of lots and lots of brilliant things like this. And it's called a book Untitled. And one of the things or a couple of the things it's looking at is, you know, the role and the heft of the title of a book, but also when can you consider a book to be finished? Where does a book have an ending? That's why some people might say it was experimental, but I just loved its treatment of all these issues about writing and history and language. Fabulous stuff. And at number 2, Solenoid, by Mircea Cartarescu, translated by Sean Cotter. Definitely the best maximalist reader that I had this year. I mean, I read Laszlo Krasner-Hawkeye's new book, Hirsch 07224, whatever it's called. That was disappointing. But this was just stupendous. Now, I have an apology to all my viewers. I did promise a review on it, a BookTube review, and I didn't get round to doing it. I mean, I don't know if you can see. So I've got quite a few sort of sticky notes, and to have done a video would have required me sitting down and transcribing all of those and forming my arguments and stuff. The problem I had this year is that when I sit down to this very desk that I'm recording on, it's been for writing my own work because I finished 2 books this year. So I just didn't have a space to sit down and go through all my notes on this. Suffice it to say, I read his novel Blinding before, and this is just sort of exponentially superior to that. But I do apologise, I don't have a video for you to go back and see why I liked it so much. It's philosophical, it's full of character studies. It's about the city of Bucharest in Romania, which becomes a character in itself. It's about death. It's about symbology. It's about religion. It's just about, you know, it's one of those books that encompasses everything. You know, if you're up for the challenge, because, you know, you've got to take your time with it, I highly recommended this. Now, my number 1 read. This is The Tyranny of Flies by Cuban writer Elaine Villar-Madruga, translated by Kevin Jerry Dunn. Now, you know, this is much more self-contained than something like that, and it's got a much more narrow scope, but it's one of those books that is just, you know, it sets its world out on page 1 and never deviates from it, never succumbs to, oh, that sounds good, I want to put that in even though it doesn't chime with it. It's about a family with 3 children who all have strange gifts or curses. They are the children of a unnamed Central or Southern American torturer for the governmental regime. They're sort of confined to barracks because he's fallen out of favour. Sorry, not confined to barracks, confined to their house because he's fallen out of favour. And the house is beset by flies, hence the tyranny of flies, who are very attracted to his medals that he still, you know, even though he's sort of lost his status, he still sort of promenades around as if he is still this sort of great general. And the children have these kinks. So the youngest is either mute or refuses to speak, but can do lifelike drawings of any animal in existence. And in a way, that's the sort of organising principle of this book. The middle son, animals that approach him and seek him out in order to die, in order to be released from their sort of imprisonment in life. So this first happened at a zoo, and it was a literal imprisonment, but even on the outside world, any animal that approaches him, seeking him out because he will release them into death. He doesn't do anything, simply by sort of being in contact with him, these animals die. And then the narrator is this woman, young sort of teenager, who has, now I can't remember the exact name for this, is it paraphraxis? But basically she's sexually attracted to inanimate objects, and in particularly a bridge in the city. So when they're under not house arrest, but when they sort of can't really get out of the house, she's pining for her love of bridge. And just the voices of these characters with these strange quirks, it's just wonderful. It's just entrancing. And it's about dictatorship, presumably the Cuban dictatorship. And it's just a brilliant parable of that. It's funny, it's clever, but as I say, it's really tightly written. It never deviates. You know, it's sort of full throttle, not necessarily the pace of the book, but in terms of just keeping on track for, you know, this sort of very strange, slightly sort of warped world. So that was my favourite book of the year. So that's it, BookTube. As I say, please, if any of those strike you as interesting, I will post the links to them in the show notes. So by all means, go and track them down, what I thought of them originally, apart from Solenoid, for which I apologise. Okay, so that's the first video 2025. Here's to a good reading year for us all. Till next time.